Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.
Tonight, Senator Elizabeth Warren calls Fed Chairman Jay Powell a dangerous man. Merck has possibly come out with an oral drug that cuts hospitalization for COVID patients by 50%. And September brought us the worst stock market since Trump closed the economy. And that and more tonight, all on Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up, and hope your week went well. I'm Andre Laborde. Our goal is bringing Wall Street to your street for today, Friday, October the 1st, 2021, and to get you ready for the week ahead. You know, the humorist Will Rogers had a saying, "No man's job is secure or his property safe when Congress is in session." Well, it was certainly true then, and it is certainly true now. Tonight, we'll be discussing the Democrats' proposed $3.5 trillion tax package, the stock market for October, and how to position your financial portfolio for the final fourth quarter of the year. Tonight, we'll be talking with Jim Spiro. Barron's Magazine has picked Jim as one of the top 100 money managers in the country, and Forbes Magazine has also picked Jim as the top in-state money manager, and he'll be with us tonight. We'll be talking with Jim in just a moment. But first, the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ all posted weekly losses. And the S&P and the NASDAQ had their worst week since February. And by the way, this week, Gene Munster from Loop Advisors has put a new price target on Apple at $200 a share. Mark Mahaney at Evercore has raised his price target of Facebook as a buy, with a new price target at $450 a share. Well, my guest this evening is Jim Spiro. As mentioned earlier, Jim is the managing director at Morgan Stanley. He was picked by Barron's Magazine as one of the top 100 asset managers in the country, and Forbes Magazine has picked Jim as best in-state asset manager. He's here with us tonight. Hi, Jim. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Hi, Andre. Good to be with you. How are you, my friend?
I am so glad and happy to have with you, especially the first day of the month like this and such, with at the end of the week. You know, Jim, I'm wondering, because we just got finished September. October is now just starting up. I've always been told that September and October are the two weakest months of the year when it comes to the stock market. First off, is that true? And do you think 2021 is going to shape up to be the same way as in previous years?
Oh, yeah, that's a two-parted question, so let's address the first part. Historically, September has been the worst month, and October, another one of the poorer months. Having said that, most people, when we approach this time of year, have this gloom and doom scenario embedded in their psyche. The reality is, if you go back over the last 100 years or so, the average rate of return in the month of September is about negative 1%. So it's not great, but it's hardly the end of the world. October also has a slightly a negative return, ever so slightly. So they're two not pretty good months. But you must understand that historically, over the last 30, 50, and 100 years, the S&P has averaged somewhere between an 8.5% and 9% return. And about 70 some odd percent of the years, it's up. So it's not the kind of thing that would cause me to turn a portfolio upside down. But yes, as a technical matter, September is the worst month of the year. But as a factual matter, we're talking about a negative 1% rate of return. What has happened is over the last 100 years, the three biggest stock market crashes, 29 and 87 and 2008, have taken place in October. And the selling began to build in September. So you get people who say, geez, 3 times crashes, all 3 times in October. It must be a cursed month. Well, that's true. It's 3, but that means the other 97 years, October, kind of went along to its own tune. So it's not the kind of thing, if something transpired once every 33 years, which is 3 out of 100, I'm not so sure I would, turn my world upside down. So there you have it.
No, I completely concur and understand with that. And I guess also, Jim, with what's going on, I mean, we have, well, I mean, this past week we've had the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, had been talking to the Senate Banking Committee about how inflation was a little bit more than what he had thought of. We're having a number of different things that were the situation in China with the Evergrande, the real estate company that I'd never heard of, but you know that was all of a sudden a sell-off for a few days ago. So a number of things have occurred this month that that you can easily understand why the month has ended the way it has.
You can, but you should also understand that perhaps one of the reasons it's ended the way it has is over the last 18 months, it's basically been straight up, and markets don't move that way. And it's true that Powell's prognostications, and that's true of his predecessors, the Fed hasn't been very good at hitting inflation on the money for the better part of 15 years. So for the longest time, they've said somewhere around 2%, give or take, is what they desire, and it's been below that. Now it's above that. So they still desire the 2, but instead of trailing it, now they're exceeding it. They continue to say it's transitory. Time will tell. Part of the cause of the inflation is the enormous amount of liquidity that the Fed is providing, but part of it is the enormous amount of fiscal stimulus from the federal government, and then, of course, a whole host of supply chain constraints that aren't so easy to deal with. With respect to Evergrande, yes, that's a serious situation, and we'll see how it develops. But the likelihood, at least in my view, of that turning into sort of a 2008 systemic financial crisis in a global sense, I think is highly unlikely. And I wouldn't expect that to transpire. So for whatever it's worth, I think Powell is basically trying to paint a glass that's more half full than half empty. And I think it is more half full than half empty. But some changed monetary policy is likely to be coming down the line. And I think he's not only intimated that, but been quite explicit in telling people it's coming.
Yeah. It reminded me this week when he was talking to the Senate Banking Committee. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Bananas with Woody Allen. There's a great scene where he's standing on the sidewalk and he's telling the guy trying to back in to a parking spot, keep going, keep going, keep going. And the guy runs right into the rear of the parked car and he goes, stop. Okay. And then just walks off. Jay Powell, keep going, keep going. And then all of a sudden, well, we may have gone a little bit too far. Okay, now we're going to stop with the bond buying and doing.
Well, look, everything you say is true, and it's a wonderful movie, one of many of his that's wonderful. But you have to realize you're dealing with a $22 trillion economy that's going through an unprecedented global pandemic, which now seems to be working its way through round 2, in a roughly a $100 trillion global economy, and monetary policy in general is like turning a battleship in a bathtub. So to get this, to nail this exactly perfectly is not an easy thing to do. But does it look like there's too much monetary accommodation at this point? Can you make that argument? Yes. And do I think it's a persuasive argument? Yes, I do.
Yeah. Jim, what about in the South Louisiana area and actually even going up into the Northeast, Hurricane Ida caused a lot of destruction, damage, work stoppages. And I mean, I remember, and I know you as well too, with Katrina 16 years ago, that put a dent in the GDP, the gross domestic product, for a little bit. Do you think that Hurricane Ida will have any kind of an effect either for the quarter or for the month that and I say Hurricane Ida in this area, and it was Tropical Storm Ida in the Northeast, because I think more people lost their lives up in the New York, Connecticut area than here in this area.
Yeah, I do think there might be some diminution in GDP. You're talking about a swath of the country, not all of the country, but I think most of it will be recaptured, and some of it actually even more so. Some of the economic activity in toto will be greater than it otherwise would have been due to rebuilding. But on balance, I think most of that is really a timing issue rather than simply a lost amount of GDP. Obviously, someone whose house is damaged, the house will be repaired. Someone who is planning to buy a car maybe won't buy a car now on his own nickel. It'll be on the insurance company's nickel, but the car will still be bought. As to a couple that went out, twice a week for dinner, that couldn't do it for the better part of 3 or 4 weeks, well, they're not going to go out when they can go back out and all of a sudden have 9 dinners to catch up. But I think most of that is a temporal thing. There are some people who actually argue that on balance, leaving aside the human cost, these kinds of catastrophic events, Hurricane Ida, Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, and God forbid something like 9/11, is actually a net economic plus. That's actually not true. That's a specious argument. And common sense should say it is, because if it were not, then every 5 years we would go in and bulldoze all the cities and rebuild them.
Mhm.
So the idea that it's a horrible, humane thing, but on balance, a net economic plus, doesn't hold up to scrutiny. But the idea that it's a huge permanent diminution in GDP, no, I think it's a timing thing. Some will be lost, and then some will be recaptured in the months to come.
I understand. Jim, what about, we have a lot, keep continuing with that same vein with the hurricane, Ida, or tropical storm, as it later turned out to be. Let's say one of our viewers had bad damage, and we'll go with a scenario. Hypothetically, they're under 59 and a half years of age, and they may have an IRA. And normally, you would not normally be able to touch your IRA, your Roth or traditional and such, until after 59. But let's say for whatever reason, their insurance company, they don't have savings, whatever the case, they need to tap it for their house or for repairs. Does the federal government give any kind of a scenario leeway that you can tap that IRA if you're under 59 and a half?
Well, in the past, they have provided on sort of a one-off basis the ability to do that from retirement accounts, particularly 401s. They may have mentioned that, and it simply escapes me, but I don't believe they've addressed that at this point. They may in the months to come. That may be the case. But you can take loans from your 401 under certain circumstances. Obviously, they have to be repaid and so forth. But it's not a conventional loan in the sense you don't have to go through a credit check, because you're effectively both the borrower and the lender. But people should realize that retirement money, if it's truly an emergency, that's one thing. But you don't want to use it as sort of when times are tough, I'll just tap into it, because you do two things. One, you obviously deplete your retirement savings. But two, I think you sort of begin to grease the wheels psychologically. Perhaps you don't even realize it, where you say, I really do have some more money floating around. Things get a little tough, or I got something I really, really, really want to do. I'll just tap into my retirement money, and then the money is not there. So there's an economic component here that I think people should weigh and try to avoid at all costs, unless their back is truly to the wall. And then there's a forgiveness component to that. To date, I don't recall hearing of anything that the federal government is going to allow vis-a-vis Hurricane Ida or Tropical Storm Ida.
I understand. And Jim, I completely understand, because once you do something the first time, it becomes easier the second, the third, and the fourth. And so-called, well, I need to tap into it, it's right there, and you start to know it. It's continuously waiting until retirement, which is what it's basically the reason that it's for.
That's correct. People have a tendency over time, once the habit is established, to confuse need with want.
Yeah.
And to try to rationalize what in fact is really a want with a need. And you can see where that can lead. So it really should be a last-ditch effort or form of behavior, in my view.
I understand. Jim, what about where they're talking right now in Washington, D.C., about a massive they're saying 3.5 trillion, but even the Wall Street Journal has said it's more like 4.5, closer to maybe even $5 trillion after you add in all the entitlements that's going to be continuous and such. Do you think that whatever is passed, whether it be 3.5, 2.5, more or less, how do you think the market is going to react to that?
Well, there'll be some more money sloshing around. You could argue whether that's in fact needed or not. I do think that we have two bills, at least as you and I speak, that are on the table. One is a $1.2 trillion package characterized as infrastructure. And we seem to have lost sight of the fact that 1.2 trillion is just a mind-boggling amount of money. We're tossing around these numbers with such regularity that I think we're getting anesthetized to them. But the $1.2 trillion budget, which seems to have some reasonable bipartisan support and likely can pass, at least addresses infrastructure as historically I've known it to be, and I believe most people know it to be, both denotatively and connotatively: schools, roads, bridges, airports, and so forth. The second bill, we are now being told, is basically human infrastructure. I've not heard that term before until several months ago. I'm not sure I understand what it means. It seems to mean support for something else. And it seems to require a remarkably elastic definition of the word infrastructure. So maybe there are reasons for doing this, but it doesn't strike me as being infrastructure, because if it's basically anything that supports something, while there may be merit behind it, the turkey and Swiss sandwich came to me on a plate today at lunch, and I guess the plate is infrastructure for the sandwich, and the bread is infrastructure for the turkey and Swiss. So I don't think I understand the characterization of what we're being presented, and I think the market is not particularly desirous of seeing the bill pass in its current size or form, and not particularly desirous of seeing the country have to borrow trillions of dollars more, whether it's 3, 4, or 5, to support what is a vast expansion of the state in the domestic economy.
And Jim, just like the Swiss on your sandwich, there's lots of holes in the budget. That's, the unanswered questions as to what is in that 3.5 that you'll have to pass it to be able to know what's in it. So
yes, I think your point is well taken, and I don't think any more need be said.
That's right, exactly. Another question before we're going to be having to go to a break in just a moment, but another question too. With that, we're going to be coming up to the debt ceiling, and the Democrats are wanting the Republicans to go along with the debt ceiling, although they really don't, because they've got enough. The Democrats have enough votes to pass the debt ceiling without it. Do you think that the market, if they don't pass the debt ceiling and continue without it for a while, the market will take a little bit of a hit? Or do you think that when they do, once they pass the debt ceiling, because they're wanting to raise so much more money, that will then cause a concern for the stock market?
Well, I think a couple of things, Andre. Number one, the debt ceiling, we're told, nobody really knows exactly when it'll be reached and subsequently perhaps breached. The Treasury Secretary says somewhere in the middle of October. She obviously has an agenda, and as well she should. So I don't know whether there's a couple of weeks of wiggle room in there. I suspect there is. The majority party is saying, look, in the past, we've gotten on board with you, the minority party, to support debt ceiling increases, even when we didn't like it. And as a consequence, you sort of owe it to us and the country to do that. They make the argument further that we're really not requiring more money to pay for new spending. We're requiring money to pay for spending that's already been agreed upon. The second argument, I think, is rather specious, because that's the way the system works. You spend today and borrow tomorrow. So unless you draw a line in the sand, and maybe this is the one to do it on, maybe you've one in the future, maybe never, maybe you just raise the debt ceiling ad nauseum. Unless you draw a line in the sand, you're never going to be able to try to have some sort of enforcement mechanism against higher spending. The minority party here basically says, look, we're on board with the $1.2 trillion worth of infrastructure, and we actually are not only on board with it, we voted. We had, I think, I don't know, 15 members, 20 members, some number, who supported it. The second thing is not infrastructure. It's a massive expansion of a series of entitlement and welfare programs, and we don't like it, and we don't support it, and we understand that you do. But if it requires additional borrowing, the same way you have the votes to pass the massive program itself, the $3.5 trillion, you have the votes necessary to raise the debt ceiling. And if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it. But we're not on board for it. As to how destructive it would be if the debt ceiling weren't passed, ultimately, I think it will be passed. I think the chances of it simply not being passed are close to zero.
We're talking with Jim Spiro. Jim is Managing Director at Morgan Stanley. We'll be right back right after this message. And we're back. We're talking with Jim Spiro. Jim is Managing Director at Morgan Stanley. He's also the head of the Spiro Group. He is Forbes Magazine has picked him as Best In-State Financial Advisor, and Barron's Magazine has picked him as one of the top 100 financial advisors in the country. Glad to have him. Jim, right before we went to the break, we were talking about the possibilities of what happens if or if not between that and the debt ceiling. But one of the other concerns is that they're going, we're about to be heading into the holiday season, and there's supply chain disruptions because, we're hearing the term bottlenecks, because we just came off of a lockdown. We just have problems between hiring people, but also getting the goods from point A to point B. In fact, I heard where in Los Angeles, there are cargo ships that are coming in from China that are just sitting out of the port waiting to unload, and that they're so far behind, and then containers are a problem. Do you think this Christmas is going to be a good one for retailers, or do you think it's something that they should be concerned about?
I think the latter, more concerned, but I think less concerned than they were a year ago, because the truth is things with respect to the pandemic are getting better. And I've said in the past to many clients, and it's a byline that always sticks in my head, it's important not to bury the headline. That's an old newspaper saying. And we get so wrapped up with Delta and supply chain bottlenecks and so forth, people are losing sight of the fact that a lot of progress has been made towards the pandemic. More and more people are vaccinated. Independent of personal reasons why you might be or not be supportive of the vaccines, they seem to have a reasonable degree of efficacy. And the economy is certainly closer to normal than it was a year ago at this time. Your point about Los Angeles, the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach is the biggest in the country. There are ships backed up, dozens of them. There are thousands, tens of thousands of containers all over the dock. They can't get the workers. In China and Europe, they have 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week shifts. The longshoremen out there do not have that as part of their contract. They're overtime shifts. But the reality is, I think there will be some supply chain bottlenecks. There may be some goods that are in short supply. The prices may be bid up. And on one hand, retailers may benefit from the fact that I think prices will be higher than they were in years past. On the other hand, they may suffer from the fact, and I suspect they will, that they will not have certain items at all, and others they will not have in sufficient stock compared to what they could sell. So I think it's better than it was. Perhaps it's a glass half filled, but it ain't perfect. I'll put it to you that way. And it won't be perfect for a while. I think you could see this well into 2022, and I've seen people suggesting 2023. But it's when you get this kind of situation that people gang on and say, this is never going to get better. And I've learned in this business after 37 years to try to stay away from words like never and always. So it's better than it was. I think it will continue to improve, albeit in a staggered manner, and there'll be some setbacks.
I understand. And I understand and agree that, it'll certainly even itself out, but the only thing was that now till the end of the year, we had a story last week on the Federal Reserve reported that there are so many trillions of extra dollars in U.S. bank accounts right now because people hadn't, like you mentioned, people hadn't been going out to dinner because of the lockdowns and for other reasons as well. So you've got this excess money with Christmas time coming and with the season, and I'm sure that's going to be burning a hole in people's pocket. And retailers would love to take advantage of that if they only had the products to sell.
I think you're right. And I also think not only would retailers love to take advantage of it, but I think people are psychologically more geared to saying, we don't know what the future brings. The last 18 to 20 months have been lousy. Let's go out and live it up and spend even more for Christmas. So I think all told, it'll probably be a reasonably good Christmas season. But I think some of the problems we talked about, the shortages of products and the delays, I don't think they're going to go away in the next 60, 90 days. No, I don't.
I understand. Jim, I just got time for about one more question and love to find out your thoughts on this. We have a lot of people that maybe work for a company that they may have a retirement program, whether it be a mutual fund that's self-directed or such. But if they want to go ahead and handle their retirement program themselves rather than have their employer do it, are they allowed to do that? And when I say themselves, it may not be actually themselves, but bring it to somebody else. Are they allowed to do that, or by law that they have to have the employer take care of it?
There's no law. There may be other impediments, but you can go to the employer. This question comes up routinely. You can go to the employer and ask if it's possible to take something called an in-service distribution, the translation of which is basically saying, look, I want to continue to be employed here. I'm happy to be employed here, but I would like to take control of my own retirement account Can I do that and roll it out of your plan into wherever the individual, he or she, may choose to do so? Some will permit it. And if so, then it's a fairly easy thing to deal with. You call up a financial institution, bank, brokerage firm, so forth, and you get in touch with the HR person or people at your employer and put the two together. And there's some paperwork and some phone calls, you can do it. Some will not permit it. And then, of course, you have another option. You can retire, or you can seek different employment, which would strike me as the tail wagging the dog. That seems to be a rather extreme response.
Right.
Because you're dissatisfied with your 401 and how it's being handled. But many employers will provide a 401 in-service distribution, some not. It's a case-by-case thing, Andre.
Jim, it's always informative and enjoyable to talk to you. I hope you come back. Hope you do it.
If you invite me, I'll be back.
That's a deal. Jim Spiro, Managing Director at Morgan Stanley. We're so happy to have him in front of the show. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Well, if you've got a question about finance or a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. You can always write us at andre@wallstreetwrapup.info. Keep it pithy or concise. We'll be glad to answer your questions. And now for a look ahead for next week. But first, on this day, October the 1st, 1971, William Windsor Jr. was the very first guest to the grand opening of this world park. What was it? Well, we'll have that answer in just a moment. Well, on this day, October the 1st, 1971, William Windsor Jr. became the very first guest to the grand opening of this world park. What was it? The answer is Disney World. Opened near Orlando, Florida, it covers 25,000 acres, of which half have been used and half have not. William Windsor Jr. Now that is a trivia question the next time you're at a party. Well, coming up in the weeks ahead for October, we've got some great guests lined up, and in just a couple of weeks, we'll be talking with the publisher of Forbes magazine and the chairman of Forbes Communication, Steve Forbes. And next week, we will be talking with the former mayor of New Orleans, Mark Morial. Mark is now the CEO and president of the National Urban League, and as on national scenes, we'll be discussing issues such as the Biden infrastructure bill or the $3.5 trillion spending bill that's now in Congress. Mark Morial will be here next week. And also as a reminder, remember we also repeat the shows on Sunday mornings, but the best way is to set your DVR so you'll never miss an episode. And that's our show for Friday, October the 1st, 2021. Hope you've enjoyed it. My thanks to Jim Spiro for joining us this evening. But as always, my special thanks is to you for allowing us into your homes tonight. And remember, you can always follow us on Facebook and WYES.org. So I hope you enjoyed your weekend. Hope you have a great weekend ahead and an even better week as well. I'll see you next week. So for Wall Street Wrap Up, I'm Andre Laborde. And remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.